A warm welcome on joining us on this morning's webinar on diversity and inclusion with our very valued guest, Dr. Harold Hillman. By way of introduction, albeit that Harold is well known to many of you, Dr. Harold Hillman is a leadership expert and executive coach. Harold has coached many C-suite leaders across the globe for over 20 years. In New Zealand, Harold has worked with organisations such as Fraternity, in New Zealand, Genesis Energy, Vector, Auckland Council, Heineken, Southern Cross Healthcare, BNZ, and that's just to name a few. I've had the privilege of working with Harold now for over 8 years, and I am delighted to host him again today. Harold has also authored 2 best-selling books, The Impostor Syndrome and Fitting In, Standing Out. I know that Harold's been busy writing his next book. Harold's new book, Empathy, The Human Side of Leadership, will be released in August, and I certainly look forward to getting my hands on this as he's been telling me about it for a while. In this morning's webinar, Harold will be sharing his insights and knowledge on diversity, inclusion, and belonging. In our complex and globalized business landscape, diversity is everywhere. Creating a diverse workforce has become an organizational and business imperative. The one aspect of the equation that is often underestimated is building an inclusive culture. By managing diversity well and building a culture of inclusion, organizations will be successful, remain sustainable, and fully leverage opportunities on hand. Before I hand over to Harold, please note this webinar ends at approximately 12 sharp. Please feel free to submit your questions throughout the webinar on this link. These will be collated for you in the last 10 minutes, and Harold will be happy to answer questions at that point. Please welcome Harold. Harold, over to you.
Lisa, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that warm introduction. We have been friends, I think we've been friends now for the better part of 15 years, a long time.
Long time.
I migrated to New Zealand in 2003 to work with Fraternity, and I think it was somewhere in that first 3 years that we met. I really appreciate our partnership. You have a superb team. The Beyond Recruitment team is a benchmark in New Zealand. And I really value our friendship and our partnership. And thank you for the opportunity to speak on a very important topic this morning. I before D. You and I met up, it feels like a couple of months ago or so, to really discuss what our focus would be today. And I told you that I had a very personal experience as someone who experienced D before there was an I. The word inclusion was not an early focal point in my realm, and so I wanted to start off by sharing a story about what it felt like back in the early days of where the word token or quota was real and tangible. Now, the last time you and I met up was in 2020. We did a virtual webinar then that year. I was in the process of writing the book, Empathy, The Human Side of Leadership. I remember in January 2020 worrying whether or not I could make a construct like empathy tangible and real for leaders. That was in January 2020, and then, of course, all of us went on I liken it to an adventure ride around COVID-19 in the sense that there was no playbook. We were all finding our way. Empathy became real. It became very real for people. Certainly in my lifetime, no other event or experience where each of us was going through it at the same time, no matter where you lived, no matter who you were, no matter your socioeconomic status, no matter your rank, all of us going through a scenario that made the construct of empathy real for us. And so I am excited about the new book coming out. And in the book, I wrote 9 case stories to exemplify the 3 components of empathy. The one component is cognitive empathy, where you understand what another person is going through. A second component is emotional empathy, where you actually have been through the same experience as someone else, and so you can viscerally feel what that is like. And then compassionate empathy, which is where I really want to start my story here, to hone in on diversity and inclusion. So that's me at 19. I had a full afro. I tried to replicate it during COVID last year, but it just didn't work. That was me at 19. That's my grandmother sitting in the chair with the glasses. And I'm around a number of my aunts, and we would have just come back from church, which is where I spent a good deal of my life growing up. And we were our family was not lucrative in terms of income by any stretch of the imagination. I grew up in the housing projects of Washington, D.C. I graduated high school in 1973 at the age of 19, and there I was, college bound. I applied to a number of universities and was admitted to 2 of them, one in Allentown, Pennsylvania, called Muhlenberg College, one in Minneapolis, Macalester College. I decided to attend Muhlenberg, and it was a wonderful opportunity for me. My family, my parents could not afford to pay college tuition for me. And so I was really reliant on a full scholarship that Muhlenberg provided me. Now, I want to put it in context for you. This was in the early days of affirmative action, is what we called it in the U.S. It wasn't until I came to New Zealand that I heard the term reverse discrimination. Reverse discrimination, the inference being that you are fixing a wrong with a wrong. And I didn't fully appreciate that in the early days of what was called affirmative action in the States. A number of universities across the U.S. were really trying to diversify their student populations. They were looking ahead, projecting ahead across the next few decades, and realizing that in order to really help the diverse tapestry of America flourish, it would really start in university by admitting more students who were Black, who were Hispanic in descent, Asian in descent, the colorful tapestry that represented America. I did not fully appreciate what that experience was going to be like until I walked into it in September of 1973. To put it in context, I had never had a conversation before with a white kid. I grew up in an all-Black family, all-Black neighborhood. All of my schools, my primary school, middle school, high school, all Black in terms of race. And so I was not fully prepared for what that experience might be like, to all of a sudden walk into a world where I was suddenly different. I was no longer able to sort of melt in. For the first time in my life, I stood out. The word quota, the word token was one that I heard a lot when I went to Muhlenberg College. I am grateful to Muhlenberg for the scholarship and the opportunity to help advance my life, very much so. But I was in I call it the freshman class of affirmative action, where in 1973, 5 Black students, me, one of them, was admitted to Muhlenberg, and there I was, all of a sudden, really in the spotlight and feeling a bit uncomfortable, being associated with the word token or quota. That was something that I had never really considered prior to walking into that experience, and there I was. Muhlenberg College, at the time, 2,000 students, and again, a handful, literally a handful of Black students to go through that experience there. It was the first time that I experienced imposter syndrome. I wrote a book in 2013 about imposter syndrome, and that is where all of a sudden you feel like you're standing out. You feel a bit exposed, and there's a tendency to try to either make yourself smaller or make yourself larger in that respect there. My strategy in the early days at Muhlenberg was to make myself a bit smaller, if I could. I was a very confident student in high school. I made mostly A's and B's, and I knew that I was college bound. But if there was something that happened in my first semester at Muhlenberg College where I felt like I couldn't get any traction. There was a sense of me finding my way in, what some social anthropologists often refer to as assimilation, where you are trying to work your way in and assimilate into the culture. And so it was a daunting experience. It was a daunting experience for me. I did not do well in my first semester at Muhlenberg College. I had 5 courses that I was taking. In the U.S. university system, you declare a major at the end of your freshman year. And I was really drawn to this whole notion of being a psychologist. It was just something that really appealed to me. And yet I didn't do very well. In my first semester, I earned 3 C's and 2 D's on my first report card from university, and that was really, really distressing to me. I couldn't figure it out what was going on. I was trying to get traction. I didn't feel welcome. I didn't experience any harsh racism or anything like that. But there was this sense of the 5 of us really finding our way together, the 5 Black students who all started in that year. We met up in the cafeteria, the school cafeteria, for meals, for lunch, for dinner. We always sat together. Some of the white students would often ask us, "Hey, why do you all always sit together?" And we would jokingly say back to them, for the same reason that you all always sit together as well. So we stood out in that respect. And at the end of my first semester at Muhlenberg, I debated about whether or not I would continue, whether or not this was really for me. Again, that I had never been in a situation before where I was struggling to belong, struggling to feel included. And my parents and I discussed it, and I came back in the second semester and gave it another go. Now, in New Zealand, the concept of fraternities and sorority is that's something that doesn't necessarily exist here, but it did in the States. And I came back from Muhlenberg. I came back to Muhlenberg in the second semester, and the fraternities at Muhlenberg were rushing freshmen. And what that meant was that you got an invitation down to 5 fraternity houses, all who were eager to have you come and be a part of them there at Muhlenberg. I noticed that a lot of my white friends who were freshmen were being invited down to the houses, but I was not invited down to any of the fraternities, and so subsequently ended up going back over to have dinner each evening at the cafeteria. And then something changed my life. A knock on my door in the second semester of university, where there were 2 white freshmen standing outside my door. And they, I knew them from classes. We were in classes together. And they said to me, Harold, we have talked to the brothers, the upperclassmen at ZBT, Zeta Beta Tau Fraternity, which was down the road at a bit, about a 5-minute walk. And they said that, hey, there's this black guy up in the dorm. He is a freshman, he's our friend, and he hasn't been invited down to any of the houses. And the upperclassmen at Zeta Beta Tau said, go up and get him and bring him down to the fraternity. And I tell you what, that was a 5-minute walk that changed the course of my life. I walked into the fraternity, and all of these people started walking towards me, what we would call the brothers, if you will, in a fraternity context, started walking towards me, extending their hands, shaking my hand, welcoming me in. For the very first time at Muhlenberg College, I felt welcomed. There was that sense of belonging that was huge for me in a way that's almost hard to describe. I write about it in the new book. The case story is called Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, based on the movie in 1967 with Sidney Poitier and Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy, whose daughter brought a black guy home to dinner for the first time. And I use that title affectionately to describe the experience of what it was like to be welcomed, truly welcomed for the first time in what seemed like an eternity at Muhlenberg. And it made all the difference in the world for me. Across those 3 years, I would go on to become president of Zeta Beta Tau as the only African-American member of ZBT at Muhlenberg College. And it was an incredible, affirming experience. My grades shot up significantly after joining. So I tell this story to emphasize that when you don't belong, when you feel you don't belong, you really are thrown off kilter. When a sense of belonging kicks in, you hit your stride. And that is exactly what happened to me at a very personal level. I could experience that. I grew up at a point in time when the word inclusion was not part of our lexicon when it comes to creating an engaging workforce for folks. And so it really did feel like a numbers game to me, not only at university, at Muhlenberg College, at Harvard, and at the University of Pittsburgh, being one of only a handful of Black students and trying to find our way there. I didn't exist. The word inclusion didn't exist. There was a word that did exist that I really, really did not like, and that word was tolerance. That word tolerance. It never resonated with me. It never resonated with me. To be tolerated. To be tolerated is the idea that I have to put up with you because the law says that I do. And so that notion of tolerance was one where at the very maximum, all you would get would be compliance. Certainly not a sense of full commitment. And so that word always bothered me. I always wondered why the word tolerance in that sense of putting up with you because we have to versus because we really value you and need you in the organization. So I considered myself to be a plant that in some occasions, whether it was in the university context or the work context, of being a plant in poor soil. And really learned that the true value of inclusion is in the soil. It's in the culture. It's in the culture. You can put healthy plants in unhealthy soil and they will wither and die. But if you put healthy plants in healthy soil, you will get a sustainable crop, the richness, the diversity that thrives. And that is really what when I think about my own personal why, when I think about the core essence of my legacy and what I want to leave behind in terms of an imprint, it really is to help organizations understand that inclusion and belonging are everything, are absolutely everything. Whenever you put your hand up voluntarily to walk into an organization, I would like to join you. I would like to become part of this organization. We all do it. That is each and every one of us, unless we've been a part of a merger or an acquisition, we voluntarily walk into an organization with the implicit expectation that you will buy into the social order, the norms around how we do things around here. And that was certainly my experience, particularly in the corporate world after after serving 7 years as a military officer, going into the corporate world and realizing how strong the gravitational pull is towards fitting in, that whole notion of fitting in. I write about it in the book, Fitting In, Standing Out, that there is, I call it life's inherent tension, and that is the tension between the need to fit in and the need to stand out. But make no mistake about it, because of the human need to belong, there is a stronger gravitational pull towards getting into the organization, fitting in, finding your way as quickly as possible there. And oftentimes, particularly in organizations that put a premium on silence. Silence is golden. Very often we find people reaching for our mute buttons to turn the volume down on perspective and things that you really associate with your experience and those types of things. Very often the pull towards fitting in is to dial your authenticity down a bit in terms of what the team needs. I grew up as a closeted gay kid and had really gotten used to turning the volume down on my persona to the point where I would not be offensive to anyone else. That was my own sense of homophobia as I was growing up as a kid. It took me going into the U.S. military, where I served as a closeted gay officer. It took me going into that experience to really appreciate for the first time in my life what it is like when you put your persona, your essence, the essence of who you are, on mute in order to fit in and be deemed acceptable and those types of things. It wasn't until the age of 42 when I came out and opened my energy to the rest of the world that I realized that sometimes fitting in can really, really, it can really strip you of your the essence of who you are. And that was an experience that that I felt I should be able to leverage in terms of my impact and the focus on what it means to be an authentic person. The standing out is a little bit harder in organizations, particularly again if we emphasize silence is golden. Very often it makes it difficult for people to stand out and bring their true selves to work each day. There is a mental model out there that a quiet team is a good team. Some people really think that way in terms of a quiet team is a good team. And I say to all of you that you want to be very concerned if you have a quiet team. That is, silence is not golden when it comes to people really being able to bring their perspective to the picture there. And so it really is managing, finding your way, especially in terms of bringing your voice and making a difference. Have you created a culture where people can actually thrive? Many of you will be familiar with Dr. Maslow, Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, published back in the 1940s or so. And it is still as relevant as ever. And I make the case that it is imperative, if you want people to thrive in the workplace, to really focus on what it means to just get beyond the two basic needs. One of those is physiological needs, and that is many people will have experienced this during the COVID scenario. New Zealand has I think 93% of the businesses in New Zealand are considered small businesses, and that is 15 or fewer people in a business. And we would have seen firsthand the impact of what that was like all of a sudden for people to lose their jobs in the face of this pandemic, to the point where people were worrying whether or not whether they would have a house, a roof over their head, or be able to feed their families and those types of things. I recall the images coming from the US with thousands of cars lined up at food banks where people are just basically trying to, just take care of the basic needs around that. Prior to the pandemic, the World Health Organization had listed insomnia as a global epidemic. And that certainly fits around those physiological needs and the intrusiveness of technology now into our lives, to the point where many people have difficulty sort of turning off, if you will, at night. And insomnia is one of those things that we would want to pay attention to. Certainly during COVID last year and this year, significant spikes in anxiety and depression in New Zealand and globally. Around the world there. So a big part of being able to thrive is having those physiological needs met. And then there's also the need for safety and security. That is physical and psychological safety and security, to the point where people don't feel harassed, bullied, and those types of things that just make a big difference. I often point out the distinction between what it means to survive versus what it means to thrive. There are some people who just want to make it to the end of the week. They keep their heads down. They just feel sort of exhausted by the time they work their way across a given week. That is not good for certainly what I would call that sense of vitality in that each individual needs in order to thrive. And so I want to make the case that there is something significant around what it means to belong, what it means to belong in organizations. That was the essence of my experience with Zeta Beta Tau back when I was 19 years of age. And for the first time, really feeling welcomed into an organization. I've got a very good friend. His name is Jack, and he just started with a new organization last week. And he called me on after his first day, and Jack described an experience that he had never experienced before, going into an organization where for the entire first day, there's a couple of hundred people that work in this company. Pretty much everyone walked up to him to welcome him, to have a conversation with him. He spent the entire first day immersed in conversations with people who wanted to know more about him and to know more about his background and what he was bringing into the organization. And he said that he had never felt so welcome. He had never felt so welcome before. That sense that we really value you and want you to be here with us. This is huge for us, was the sense that he was gaining. And it was visceral. It was visceral for him. It was so connecting, that sense of belonging. And so around inclusion, there is this notion that to belong really does invigorate you to the point where you feel like you can be your authentic self, as opposed to imposter syndrome sometimes, where you either make yourself smaller or larger to ward off that sense of feeling exposed. A sense of belonging is very, very important. Most organizations tend to induct people across a 3-month period, largely associated with learning systems and processes and protocols and those types of things, as opposed to a real sense of welcome. That same sense that I felt at the fraternity. That same sense when people walk across the room to extend their hand to welcome you in. That is a true sense of belonging. Dr. Maslow then talked about the need for esteem. The need for esteem. We as human beings really do like to know if we are making a difference. Not only is there a need to belong and be a part of something, but there is a need to know that we are making a difference. And very often we miss the mark on being able to fuel people where it matters the most. When we talk about inclusion and the significance of inclusion, a big part of that is reminding people on a day-to-day basis how they make a difference, that type of thing. Where you say to a direct report, hey, thanks for that question in the meeting. That question really turned the conversation in a way that had significant impact, and really appreciate your doing that. Or thanks for your perspective. Thanks for just basically affirming people. Affirmation. A big part of helping people feel included is fueling them around where they make a difference. The word thank you is we need a little bit more of that in organizations in terms of fueling that need for esteem. It really is important. You are more likely to be able to fuel another person's esteem if you aren't worried about having to be the best, the baddest, the biggest voice at the table. And I make the case that an authentic leader helps other people bring their authenticity as well, and are very affirming in that respect there. So the basic question for you all as leaders is, do you affirm people around you enough? Do you fuel their esteem and that sense of the value that they're adding? And then the fifth need on Dr. Maslow's hierarchy is, he called it self-actualization. I've put the word purpose in there, which is, in my interpretation, in 2021, equivalent to what Dr. Maslow talked about as self-actualization. And that is helping people believe that the impact of their work is bigger than just a paycheck. Bigger than just a paycheck. None of us are probably independently wealthy, so we do need a paycheck, but the degree to which we invest ourselves every day, every week, every month, across the course of a year, across the course of a lifetime, at some point, purpose kicks in. Is it bigger than a paycheck? There was a fantastic McKinsey article out in April on it was a US-based study, which was showing that a number of people over the last 18 months or so, going through the COVID scenario, have started to redefine purpose and meaning in their life. And in some cases, people leaving certain professions to join others based on a heightened sense of life, meaning, and those types of things. And so helping humans thrive, I will often make the case that you don't necessarily need a big budget to drive strong engagement. If you help people feel that they belong, a real sense of inclusion, if you fuel their esteem, affirm them, and enable them to think about the impact that they can have in their life at a broader sense, that's what it means to thrive in a workplace. I often talk about the 10 tenets of inclusion. Inclusivity is as human as it gets. We are wired for empathy. We are wired to understand, to feel, and to really show compassion to others. The whole sense of culture, soil, plants, sustainability, those types of things. You really do want people to feel safe. You want them to feel secure. So in an ecosystem of safety, there are no oppressors. There are no victims. You should welcome and value and affirm people who want to belong and who want to make a difference. Again, I look back to my friend Jack's experience joining that organization last week and feeling it viscerally. It was something he had never experienced before. It is important to appreciate people for their authenticity, their authentic selves, aligned around a common purpose, whatever that may be, but that sense of purpose is very important. Leadership is defined by voice and perspective, not by rank. Now, I had an interesting, it was about 5 years ago or so, after a presentation, a young man came down to, at the end of the presentation, he stayed behind after everyone else had left, and he wanted to have a conversation with me about a valuable lesson he had learned about leadership. He was the youngest member of a team of 7. It was an all-male team prior to 4 weeks earlier when the first woman joined the team. And he, whenever the woman left the room, the guys would really tear into her and really just vulgar language, stuff that you would never want to be said about your mom, your wife, your sister, your daughter. And yet this young guy, he was 21 at the time, he found himself laughing along with the others, even though he didn't really feel good about it. He found himself laughing. And then it continued. He actually had a coffee with the woman who joined the team, and she shared with him that she was finding it very difficult to fit in. That she was just finding it. There was something that just wasn't clicking or working, and so 2 weeks later, after she left the room again, the guys tore in on her again. And this young guy, he just stood up. He banged the table and he stood up. His heart was palpitating. He got up from his seat and he said to the others, to his male peers around the table, some of whom were twice as old as him, and he says, "I'm not standing for this anymore. I am not putting up with this anymore. This is not right. This is not right. We are not helping her feel a sense of belonging." And then he walked out of the room, and he thought that he described it as a heart palpitating moment where he just went outside. And 10 minutes later, his boss came out to see him. And this 21-year-old immediately started to apologize for having spoken up. And his boss stopped him and said to him, "Thank you for helping us be a better team. Thank you for that. Thank you for reminding us who we should be." And that was a powerful lesson for him, that leadership is not about rank, it's not about age. Leadership is defined by your voice and your perspective and making a difference. If you really value inclusion, you turn the volume up on people's voices, not down, not turning the volume down, but turning the volume up on their voices, not defined by rank, but just bringing perspective, which makes a difference. I do believe that noisy teams are healthier than quiet teams. Be very concerned if you have a quiet team. The essence of that is that if you require everyone around the table to think exactly as you do, you don't really need them there. Noisy teams are healthier. Your demography really does reflect the diversity across and beyond your value chain. And just so be mindful of that. As a young manager at Amoco Corporation in Chicago, we talked about a significant number of, particularly Amoco and its brand in the day, a huge brand in the African American community, yet you didn't have a real representation of diversity at the table in terms of perspective and those types of things, which makes a difference. It is important to affirm, reward, and promote people who support the success of others. That's associated with your why. That's associated with your how in terms of leadership. And then it is important, ultimately, it is important to enable people to thrive and to be successful. So ultimately, around inclusion, Liza, around the construct of inclusion, it is important for everyone who considers him or herself a leader to be mindful of your shadow, particularly the more senior you are. Having served as a military officer, I was always, of course, in uniform, where you're being saluted hundreds of times a day, and where you walk into a room and people stand up at attention and you have to put them at ease. You have to put them at ease. In the military, you're more mindful about the fact that your shadow amplifies significantly, and that very often rank can be daunting. It can be daunting to the point where sometimes people close up when someone of higher rank walks in. And so you have to go out of your way to make it easier for people to bring their authentic voice to the table. Sometimes we forget about that in the corporate space. That's been my experience, having served as a military officer and as a corporate executive. I find that sometimes in that corporate space, in that business space, sometimes people are not as purposeful with their leadership, making it easier for people to just be their authentic selves, bring their authentic selves to work. And so I would encourage anyone who is in a leadership role to be more mindful, be more present, be more mindful around what it means to help other people bring their perspective, feel included, and make a big difference where it matters the most for them. Liza, I will stop there. It's 11:45. Just to see if there are any questions.
Hi, Harold, can you hear me?
I can.
Great. Okay, so we do have a number of questions that are starting to come through. One of the first ones here that I see is organizations sometimes focus on staff equity, group networks, bringing together people from the same background or identity to enable them to feel a sense of belonging. Is this approach right, or does it avoid the challenge of true inclusion and integration?
It's important to there's been a lot of focus on unconscious bias now. In the book, in the book Empathy, I write about emotional intelligence, and intuition is a big part of EQ. Intuition really is a sort of a confluence of a number of unconscious biases that we just need to be mindful of. So we tend to hire people who remind us of us. We tend to recruit people who perhaps went to the same school or worked in the same company or grew up in the same part of the world, or those types of things, what we call affinity bias, et cetera. It is very important, and it is very important in recruiting, selecting people for the team to really think about whether or not you are at a subliminal level just reinforcing affinity bias or confirmation bias or those types of things as well. So I would just say, again, be more mindful about the fact that with diversity, there comes a myriad of perspective and experience that can often raise the heat level at the table. Heat is good in terms of conflict. You want a certain degree of heat.
Discomfort.
That's right. Discomfort. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's equivalent to silence. Again, silence. Be mindful of a silent team who have turned their voices off. I often say that they don't actually turn their voices off. They just end up turning them on back at the meeting after the meeting. If you don't create an inclusive culture at your table, there are going to be meetings after the meeting. And if you want to cut down on the number of meetings, make it easier for people to just bring their perspective in the first instance.
That's right, Harold. So another question sort of leading off from that, which sort of includes some of that, is, do you have any advice on how to make inclusion and diversity more of a visible part of an organization, and how do you get leadership on board?
Yes, I am a big advocate of no longer talking about diversity and inclusion as an initiative that sits over here. That it should be how we develop leaders. And again, growing up in the early days of affirmative action, it really did feel like a tick the box. I remember Diversity Day. I remember in my first role at Amoco Corporation, we would have Diversity Day, which was where everyone was required to sit in a conference room for a full day and be sort of lectured at, and those types of things. We need to get rid of the tick the box mentality around diversity and inclusion. It needs to be a part of how we develop leaders. It needs to be a part of how we enable people to thrive in the workplace. Back in the 70s, 1970s or so, we didn't have a whole lot of empirical data to support the rationale, the validity of diversity and the impact that it has on performance in an organization. In 2021, those data are prevalent all around us, big time. So I find that you no longer have to make a business case for diversity and inclusion. Most progressive CEOs and senior executives are across the fact that there is innovation, there is rich perspective, new ideas, all of those things that really flourish when you put people with different experiences, backgrounds, whether it be based on ethnic, racial, gender, what have you. Diversity flourishes when it comes to performance.
The total spectrum of diversity. And I think many times we forget that diversity includes so many different things that we need to keep our minds open to. Here's a question from Nat. Hey, Harold. Great to see and listen to you again. When you were the president of your fraternity, did you do anything different to help make a change within the house or university, especially around inclusiveness?
Wow. Did I think by virtue of me being elected as president in my senior year, I took that as as being very validating. It was very affirming. I didn't feel like a token anymore. I know what it's like to feel like a token, and I know what it's like to really be wanted and to belong. And so I really, in my senior year, when I was elected president, I felt that was validation and a true sense of belonging to a family. That was empathy. The fraternity I joined, by the way, I didn't mention this earlier, it was a Jewish fraternity at a Lutheran school. It's a Jewish fraternity. It was a Jewish fraternity. And these guys could empathize with me. This is one of the reasons why I wrote about it as a case story in the new book, as a form of compassionate empathy, is that when those two freshmen went down to the house and said, hey, there's this black dude up in the dorm who is not getting any invitations to come pledge any of the fraternities. And those upperclassmen sent those two freshmen up to get me, bring me back down to the house and make a difference. It was the essence of compassion to reach out, and it made such a huge difference for me. And so I hope that becoming the president of Zeta Beta Tau as the only African American member in that chapter at Muhlenberg College, I hope that was more than symbolic, that it was substantive in terms of the impact.
Somebody's also asked, I really like what you're saying about affirming people. How have you helped leadership teams do that more? I guess through your leadership coaching.
I would just say, this is part of caring. It's part of caring. People work hard. They come to work. Most people come to work wanting to make a difference, no matter what their role is. They just want to make a difference. They just want to have impact. And sometimes we miss the opportunity to affirm people, just to say nice job or thank you, those types of things. Sometimes we are so distracted and busy and frenetic and racing around. And oftentimes we only focus on the negative. This didn't go right, that didn't go right, this is a mistake, that's a mistake, as opposed to fueling people. There is a human need for esteem. And again, I say you don't need a huge budget for engagement. You don't need a huge budget for engagement. What is really required is to acknowledge people for where they make a difference. In the smallest ways, how they make a difference can be very fueling, particularly in terms of that sense of belonging. When we don't when we don't create an inclusive environment, I mean, that's how gangs form. Very often people join gangs because the rest of society has sort of blocked them out. And a gang will make you feel good about your contribution.
Belonging and caring about you, I guess.
That's right. That's right. That is exactly right. And so it really reinforces. Sometimes people will go out of their way to belong to any group that will make them feel good about themselves. It is something that leaders should not take for granted. Thank people, affirm them, let them know how they make a difference. It is so fueling. It is. You talk about people thriving. There is nothing like knowing or hearing that your work, your contribution has made a significant difference on the outcome.
Harold, where does unconscious bias feature in this equation? Because, diversity, inclusion could be a dusty policy that sits on a wall somewhere. However, there is unconscious bias throughout an organization. What sort of advice do you have there?
Be mindful of it. There are some good articles out there now. There's a lot of stuff out there on the internet on unconscious bias. I dove into it as I was writing the book Empathy around it. And it's just helpful for people to understand that number one, it's how human beings are. We're wired for unconscious biases, but being aware of them, being aware of the fact. We sometimes call it intuition, and that is, oh, I have a feeling. That's how we typically describe intuition. I have a feeling that this person may not be right for the role, even though the CV has all the requisites for the role. Sometimes there's that feeling. And what I would suggest to people is get under that feeling a little bit more. What's your intuition telling you in terms of this person will fit, but that person won't? This person I like, but this person I don't. What's going on there? Are you being impacted by sort of those subliminal lenses that often means that we bring people to the table that remind us of us? It's easier that way very often, but you don't get the best results around it. So I would just encourage any of your viewers today to just dive into a couple of articles around unconscious bias. And if anything, have a conversation with your team around whether or not you all need to be more mindful about decisions in terms of who we hire, who we promote, who we, lift into leadership roles, those types of things.
The questions are coming in fast and furiously, Harold, as we've got the brain working here. Another question here is, how would you best convince leaders who themselves may not be diverse in their backgrounds of the importance of addressing the needs of diverse colleagues?
Yeah, I would just say to around that whole notion of cognitive empathy, put yourself in the shoes of another person. Sometimes it is helpful. So, it was last week or so that a friend of mine talked about being in a discussion, a very tough discussion with someone who did not value diversity. That this was a person who, it was a guy, and she was in a conversation with him, and he said, I don't believe that you should hire women who aren't qualified to be in a particular role. And then she said to him, "Hey, you have a daughter? Do you have a daughter?" And he said, "Yes." And so she just started proceeding to walk him through what that would be like if his daughter was on the other side of a conversation where someone disqualified her because of her gender. And he got it. It resonated with him. It was no longer abstract or conceptual. It was real, and he could put his daughter's face in that scenario there to appreciate that would not be a good experience for someone to be told that they aren't worthy of sitting in a particular role because based on gender. So I would just say that empathy goes a long way to helping people understand what it would feel like if you were in that scenario.
Thanks, Harold. We are running out of time. I'll close with, there's a lot of thank yous here. There's a lot of people saying hats off to Harold. Brilliant talk. Thank you. Lots of thank yous. And I guess we're not going to be able to cover all the questions now, but one of the questions before I wrap up was the title of your new book, Empathy, and why you've actually split empathy. Or thigh. If you could quickly tell us about that, and then I'll wrap up because we are 12 o'clock.
It was more of a brand. I wanted to deconstruct empathy in the same way that I did with authenticity when writing the book, The Impostor Syndrome. And so it was more to sort of pull people in towards the title, with it being because I'm deconstructing it in terms of the three components: cognitive, emotional, and compassionate empathy.
Wonderful. Time to wrap up. Unfortunately, we could carry on all day with the questions, but we've run out of time. I'd like to thank Harold. Thank you so much for your insights, your knowledge, and your wisdom, and making it real in terms of your personal experiences. I'd like to just let everybody know that this webinar will be available as a recording, and if you're interested in seeing it, contact myself, liza.viz@beyond.co.nz, or visit our website. We'll have email addresses there. Thank you all for joining us today, and all the best with your endeavors in building self-awareness and in building awareness across your leadership teams with regards to driving diversity, inclusion, and above all, belonging, as Harold has indicated. Thank you.